This week we're off to Kenya and we're going to be drinking Chinga AA washed.
My name is Steve Layton and I travel the world finding amazing and delicious coffee for you to drink at home. Some make coffee difficult to understand and complicated, but here it's my job to make it easy and fun and tell you what's in my mug.
So Kenya is a super important coffee, but it wasn't until 2014 where I was able to actually do my first trip there. And my aim was not to meet producers, but rather to get an insight into how the market works, how we can improve quality, and how I can buy coffee from Kenya. Much of Kenya's coffee is cooperatives, which means it's tougher to go visit a person or build a long-term relationship. But that said, it's not impossible, and you do end up kind of getting a different face to coffee. Speaking with leaders and chairmen of washing stations and co-ops is really interesting. And Othaya were one of the ones that were most open to it. Based at the Othaya mill, they have a whole kind of series of cupping where they have a QC person, they have a small roastery, which they roast coffee for the local market, and trying to add value wherever they can. And at that central mill, they have a number of outlying wet mills, and Chinga being one of them. When I went, I was lucky enough to go to Chinga to meet the manager and just kind of start to feel out the relationship. I kind of broke the usual rule about not buying when you're in country, but just cupped it and loved it and had to buy it there and then. Chinga is managed by Gary John, and he basically makes everything happen there. And it was a conversation with Gary that we were able to get him to do a natural processed Kenyan, which is pretty unusual. It's located around about 5 kilometres to the southwest of the town of Nyeri, which is a very famous coffee grown region of Kenya. The Chinga mill has 783 members, and most of them only own very small pieces of land, like 0.2, 0.5 hectares. And they will harvest the coffee themselves and then sell it to the mill. And what used to happen was then it would just be processed and sent to government auction. But what's happening now, you see more and more mills kind of getting marketers that will reach out to people like me and help build and foster that relationship. And you know, Chinga's been a staple now for 4 years, which if I'd got that guarantee at the beginning of going to Kenya, I would have jumped at that chance. So as always, I'm going to taste this coffee at the end, but I really want to take a little bit of a focus on the tasty notes of Chinga. So it's always had that lemon and white sugar, a classic Chinga flavour as we call it here, and this one's no different. We choose our coffees from Chinga, from the cupping table, and we're always trying to kind of match that profile year on year. But it's really kind of fun that we can hit what we call a classic profile from there, because so often coffees will change year on year. You know, if we look at the coffees from Kariga and from Kieni that we have from Kenya, they definitely change every year, whereas Chinga is one that we can always rely on to have that very similar profile. So this week I'm going to talk about the processing of this coffee, and the reason I wanted to do it on this particular coffee is processing in Kenya is a fairly unique way of processing the coffee. If it has any similarities at all, it's to Ethiopia, and that's because they're neighbours, so you know you're going to get some of that. So the coffee is delivered normally to a co-op, and in this case it is a co-op. And it will go through the depulping process. So a very basic 3 or 4 disc depulper will remove the cherry from the seed, leaving the seed in parchment, but with a really sticky kind of gooey mucilage stuck to it. And there's a number of ways that you can break that down. So you can do a dry ferment, which in El Salvador, for instance, is very typical, where you will leave the coffee in some kind of like bucket or container or receiving area, and it would just break down naturally. Now in El Salvador, it will break down naturally because you have warmer temperatures in the evening, and it kind of allows it to break down. And that process will take 8 to 12 hours maybe. Whereas in Kenya, with this coffee, it gets much colder in the evenings. So what they do is they put it in water, because although it gets colder in the evenings, it gets much hotter during the day. So you want to kind of slow down that process, and the water slows down that process because it keeps it a more stable temperature. And then that mucilage will break down. Now, when you use the water, it tends to take somewhere between 24 and 48 hours. There's also a need to change that water regularly because you don't want it to become kind of kind of dirty and gooey, because that's going to come across in the coffee. So changing the water regularly will be really important. And then after the process is finished, it goes through channels. So from the receiving tank, they open it and it goes through a walkway about that thick, with water pushing it along. And quite a lot of the time they'll use a brush to actually make sure all of the mucilage is cleaned off and taken away. It's then taken from those channels to the drying beds, and on the drying beds it will sit there anywhere between 10 and 24 days, depending on the weather, the particular climate for that region, and how that's affected. So that's Kenya processing. Let's get brewing. Actually, it's not brewing, it's pouring, because it's already very kindly been brewed for me. Oh gosh, my Stumptown mug. I haven't seen this for ages. So let's dive in. So we've had a lot of, this is the second Kenyan we've had in just a few weeks, but I love that this Kenyan is so different. It's got such a bright lemon acidity to it, almost lemon zest like. It really is just like the shreddings of the peel. Very sweet, little bit of like kind of sherbety kind of flavours in there, but like an orangey sherbet. Very sweet, but finishes beautifully creamy. Just something that you always find, well, I always tend to find in the Kenyans that I like, that have that very creamy finish to them as well. Great texture to it as well. Really feeling the mouthfeel on this one. Delicious coffee, I hope you will agree. Thank you for joining me, thank you for coming along, and look forward to seeing you next week. But do remember, life is too short for bad coffee.